Hello and welcome. This is Herman, Bavinck's Generous Theology. I'm Romans 9:18, and today we're going to look at a particular contemporary figure who is advocating right out of the playbook that Herman Bavinck understood and addressed 100 years ago. All right, previously we saw that Bavinck detailed a transition in culture around older, pre-Enlightenment religious ways of thinking to new and enlightened secular ways of thinking from this new field of a secular psychology. And the steps included a narrative. And so to embrace this new field of psychology was to presuppose that religious thought was atavistic, primitive. It was a throwback. It was something, a remnant that was vestigial. And the religious mind, in some sense, corresponded to a child's mind. It was immature and it was impressionable and gullible, and thoughts and beliefs were externally imposed, an absence of critical thinking. Whereas in the new narrative, the enlightened secular mind corresponds to adulthood, to a rise of mature and new passions in the thinker, a new thirst for autonomy and independent critical thinking. So think of motifs such as the marketing of the claim of blind faith versus science as a great example. Next slide. And so let's take a look at one contemporary who is articulating in a continued fashion from this same playbook. Psychologist Steven Pinker, in his book Enlightenment Now, argues the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress. And here's a quote that I believe is very telling from the work. If there's anything the Enlightenment thinkers had in common, it was an insistence that we energetically apply the standard of reason to understanding our world, and not fall back on generators of delusion like faith, dogma, revelation, authority, charisma, mysticism, divination, or the hermeneutic parsing of sacred texts. Next slide. This fits right in with the themes and motifs that we read in a similar work from author James Lindsay, Everybody is Wrong About God. And in this work by Lindsay, and Pinker continues the trend, theists in general and Christians in particular arrive to the debate between theism and atheism, only to find that in the opening statement, the atheist declares the debate has already occurred and the atheistic position has already won, and it is nothing but foolish nonsense to otherwise continue the charade. And so from the atheistic secular perspective of writers like Lindsay and Pinker, there is no need to address dogmatic religious content. There is no need, as Pinker says, to hermeneutically parse sacred texts. We've already moved past the proof stage, and any further participation from theists, to the contrary, represents nothing but sour grapes or an unreasonable desire to regress instead of progress. An unhealthy unwillingness on the part of the theist to admit defeat, an unwholesome dogmatism, etc., etc. Imagine going to a debate where in the opening statement one side declared victory, and that further continuation by the other side was evidence of malfeasance and a lack of goodwill. Next slide. Here's another quote. It was reason that led most of the Enlightenment thinkers to repudiate a belief in an anthropomorphic God who took an interest in human affairs. So Pinker would offer that Christianity is refuted by the output of Enlightenment thinking. His footnote at this passage gives the following justification. Most Enlightenment thinkers were non-theists. Is this really a clarity of thinking by Pinker? Has he reasoned well? Next slide. So imagine making an argument. Most Enlightenment thinkers were non-theists, therefore, belief in an anthropomorphic God who is interested in human affairs is repudiated. Is this a sound argument? A few responses from a theist might point out that even Pinker himself recognizes that many Enlightenment thinkers were theists, even luminaries such as Kant, Schleiermacher, or Hegel, or the later Schlegel, and others. But let's ask here, are profound facts about the nature of reality decided by consensus? Is meaning and value and what is true and objective up for parliamentary protocols and voting? And what about, finally, the doctrinal content and philosophical arguments made by theists? Don't they need to be answered? Next slide. Pinker, of course, gives other reasons. We'll list 4 of them here and talk about them in more detail. One thing he notes is that reports of miracles were dubious. He also considers that the authors of holy books were all too human. Thirdly, he shows that natural events unfold in reality without a regard to human welfare. And finally, different cultures believed in mutually incompatible deities. Now, the deliberate application of reason, Pinker says, was necessary precisely because our common habits of thought are not particularly reasonable. And so the thesis for this program is that Pinker's arguments and Lindsay's arguments are not formal demonstrations or proofs, but rather product marketing and the expression of preference. Or put another way, a form of intellectual hypergamy. Next slide. So the first thing to look at is Pinker's claim that reports of miracles were dubious. Well, dubious to whom? The non-believer? We have an issue of the cart and the horse here, don't we? Just why should, for example, 2 basketball players, let's take, for example, Dr. J, playing a game of one-on-one with Larry Bird, or LeBron James playing Michael Jordan, if we want to be a little more contemporary. Why should the game's outcome be decided by having one of the 2 players not only playing in the game, but also being the referee? So think of this scenario. Think of Larry Bird taking a nice, clean 3-point shot and hitting nothing but net, only to have Dr. J say, I find that highly dubious. 0 points for you, Larry Bird. Wouldn't that seem partisanly wrong? Further, there are credible reports of the miraculous, which are maturely understood to be found. It is actually not that there is a lack of evidence. Next slide. I'll share a personal testimony. I myself, Romans 9:18, have been personally healed by God of stage 4 cancer in 2018. To God be the glory. And of course, it's not just me personally that has such testimonies to offer. For one other contemporary example, we have people who are alive who were witness to a miracle. Prayer was used to raise a dead man back to life. No joke. No evidence? I think Professor Pinker has made some errors in his methodology here. Next slide. The next idea are that the authors of holy books were all too human. Now, I think this ignores the Christian position, which must be addressed, and that is, the Bible is a dialectic synthesis of human and divine authorship. In other words, Christians speak of it as a theanthropic product, both human and divine. And now wait a minute here. This doesn't even make sense on Pinker's own terms. For the authors of science books are similarly all too human, and yet Pinker and company have no worries that such texts have the possibility of conveying an objective truth about reality. And this comes back to the thesis of hypergamy. Pinker and Lindsay, others from this vein, really seem to communicate. Their argument is not just that the Bible authors were human, rather that the Bible authors were not God, and that there was no divine product, and also the Bible authors were lesser humans at that, and what they wrote or communicated can be dismissed. Next slide. And now, in his third objection, Pinker notes that natural events unfolded with no regard for human welfare. And I want to just wait a minute here. I thought Pinker was advocating for a history of progress in the human condition. Isn't the increasing prosperity and conditions for human flourishing and Enlightenment thinking? Aren't such things evidence for natural events unfolding with regard for human welfare? The argument's simple. The existence of progress in societies really is an evidence for a godly regard for human welfare. Next slide. And finally, Pinker objects that different cultures believe in mutually incompatible deities. And this is a classic fallacy. The existence of the counterfeit does not, in fact, disprove the existence of the genuine. In fact, there's a counterclaim to Pinker. There's a case to be made here that the existence of the counterfeit establishes that there is something genuine being counterfeited. So, for example, why are there no $17 counterfeit bills, but lots of examples of $20 and $100 counterfeit bills? Well, the answer is simple, because $20 bills and $100 bills are genuine and objectively exist, while the $17 bill doesn't. All right. Thank you, Professor Pinker. We'll come back to him more in future episodes. Let's take a look now in our next section at a very interesting article and how it seems that thinkers from the Enlightenment like to give themselves a license to, well, let's just say, color outside the lines. And so the title of the article is, "The Hyper-Sane Are Among Us, If Only We're Prepared to Look." And the subtitle says, "Sometimes those who seem a little crazy are the ones who really get it." Now, the article starts off with a very direct thesis, and it goes like this. The author cites the Scottish psychiatrist, R.D. Laing, who presented an idea or a thesis that madness was a voyage of discovery that could open out or lead onto a free state of higher consciousness or hyper-sanity. And for Laing, the descent into madness could lead to a reckoning, to an awakening, or to a breakthrough rather than a breakdown. Next slide. And so, as an example, Laing asks us to consider the example of Carl Jung. And he writes, as Europe tore itself apart in the First World War, Jung gained first-hand experience of psychotic material in which he found, and I quote, "the matrix of a mytho-poetic imagination, which has vanished from our rational age." What an interesting concept here. For it is precisely this sort of supernatural or turn to the supernatural that Laing and the author here, Neil Burton, commend, which is an interesting concept because earlier in the Enlightenment, thinkers like Schleiermacher and Schlegel and others from the Jena and New University had done their utmost to banish such things from polite society. And so now, that which the Enlightenment brights had vanished is being smuggled back in through the back door. Maybe the Enlightenment thinkers dismissed it a little too early. Next slide. And so the thesis here is that Jung read Gilgamesh, Odysseus, Heracles, Orpheus, and Aeneas before him, and he traveled deep down into an underworld where he conversed with Salome, an attractive young woman, and with Philemon, an old man with a white beard, the wings of a kingfisher, and the horns of a bull. And so immediately, the first question that comes to my mind is, why would an Enlightenment thinker drink from the well of Greek mythopoetry, but not do the same with the Christian well of divine revelation? Why look within and not look to an objective external ideal? Next slide. And so the author of this article continues, although Salome and Philemon were products of Jung's unconscious, they had lives of their own and said things that he had not previously thought. In Philemon, Jung had at last, long last, found the father figure that both Freud and his own father had failed to be. More than that, Philemon was a guru and prefigured what Jung himself was later to become, the wise old man of Zurich. As the war burnt out, Jung re-emerged into sanity. And so as a believer, I want to point out to my non-believing friends, do we not see the irony here? The supernatural elements of revelation, which were rejected in Christian form by the Enlightenment thinkers, are now being smuggled right back in through the back door of the inner journey. Next slide. And the other exemplar that the author of this article points out is the Greek sophist Diogenes, the cynic. And once this cynic was asked to name the most beautiful of all things, Diogenes, what is the most beautiful of all things? And Diogenes replied with the one-word answer, parrhesia, which in his ancient Greek language meant something like an uninhibited thought, or free speech, or full expression. Diogenes, the cynic, we will find, is very critical. He used to stroll around Athens in broad daylight, brandishing a lit lamp. And whenever curious people stopped to ask what he was doing, he would reply, I am just looking for a human being. And of course, he was insinuating that the people of Athens did not measure up. Next slide. And so, in fact, taking a look here, we can see, in some senses, we can see modern thinkers as new and interesting forms, or a rediscovered form of the ancient Greek sophist. So part of Diogenes' backstory is that before he came to Athens, he was somewhat of a counterfeiter, and then he emigrated to Athens, lived the life of a beggar, and continued to challenge the coins where he lived. This time, it was the coinage of custom and convention. He maintained a false currency of morality was what the other people held. Next slide. Diogenes disdained the need for a conventional shelter or any other such trivialities, and elected to live in a tub and survive on a diet of onions. And he proved, to the later satisfaction of the Stoics, that happiness has nothing whatsoever to do with a person's material circumstances. And he held that human beings had much to learn from studying the simplicity and artlessness of dogs, who, unlike human beings, had not complicated every simple gift of the gods. Next slide. And this is a very interesting point here. The term cynic itself derives from the Greek word kainikos, which is the adjective meaning dog. And so Diogenes was a profane, cynical dog who lived in a tub and ate a diet of onions, of course making him a social outcast and very undesirable to be around. Once, in public, he was relieving himself in a very inappropriate public fashion, and Diogenes' words were that he regretted that one could not relieve hunger in the same way by rubbing an empty stomach. A profane thinker indeed. Next slide. And then on another occasion, someone asked where he was from, and he replied, I am a citizen of the world, which, as far as we know, seems to be the first recorded use of the term cosmopolitan. And when he approached death, Diogenes asked for his body to be thrown outside of the city walls so that wild animals could feast. And after his death, the people in the city he lived in put up a statue or a pillar surmounted by a dog. And so the idea here, and I apologize for the rough and profane language here, the idea is one dog dominating another dog in a sexual fashion. And so you can just hear the contempt that Diogenes has for other people, even as he himself is considered beneath contempt by his peers in the city. And when I read about this, something clicked in my mind. Perhaps you've seen, as the picture here indicates, perhaps you've seen when young men in a culture walk around with their pants down and their underparts exposed to the public. For a long time, I wondered, what is that about? What were they trying to say with those fashion choices? And I came to understand that perhaps in most of these cases, these are modern or contemporary expressions of the kind of contempt or disgust that Diogenes had. Next slide. And so the article continues. Jung and Diogenes come across as insane by the standards of their day. But both men had a depth and acuteness of vision that their contemporaries lacked, and that enabled them to see through the facade of sanity. Both psychosis and hypersanity place us outside of society, making us seem mad to the mainstream. Both states attract fear and fascination. But whereas mental disorder is distressing and disabling, hypersanity is liberating and empowering. Look at the author's use here. The author speaks of the standards of the day, as if Jung and Diogenes were simply dismissive of an impermanent cultural set of values and mores. And so, what some people call madness, this author says might actually be, in some cases, liberating and empowering. Next slide. And so here are the elements of the modern hyper-sane thinker, according to this article. To be free from the obligations of convention, free to be profane, free to be an onion eater, free to relieve one's passions in public like a dog, free to be the top dog and dominate, free to have a buoyant optimism that prefers one's own madness over what the other side has to offer. For example, in the Christian case, the offer is a submission to God and his divine authority, revelation and dogmas, and living under rules and conventions. And so we mentioned earlier, free to be profane and live on a diet of onions, live as a vagabond. And finally, free to look inside one's own self and find the mythopoetry within. Why then should the mythopoetry of Christian divine revelation, at least as the Enlightenment thinkers present it sometimes, why should that be rejected? Next slide. And so the article concludes, if there is such a thing as hypersanity, the implication is that mere sanity is not all it's cracked up to be. It is a state of dormancy and dullness with less vital potential. It's even worse than the state of madness. This, the author thinks, is most apparent in the average person's frequently suboptimal responses to the world around them. Next slide. The author continues, many normal people suffer from not being hypersane. They have a restricted worldview, confused priorities, and are racked by stress, anxiety, and self-deception. As a result, they sometimes do dangerous things and become fanatics or fascists or otherwise destructive people. By contrast, hyper-sane people are calm, contained, and constructive. Is this for real? Next slide. It is not just that the sane are irrational, but that they lack scope and range, as though they've grown into being the prisoners of their arbitrary lives, locked up in their own dark and narrow subjectivity. These poor, sane people, unable to take leave of themselves, they hardly even look around them. They barely see the beauty and possibility, and they rarely contemplate the bigger picture. And so the article's thesis is a narrative inversion. What is down is up, and what's up is down. It is a form of insanity to be sane, and true sanity is the hypersanity, found only through the journey of insanity. What? What an article. Next slide. And so this article, as crazy as it is, encompasses the idea of a special status for the hypersane, modern, enlightened thinker. He or she goes where others cannot go. The rules that apply to normal people don't apply to him. He is free to be profane, a scoundrel, to march to the tune of his own drummer. And he, in his journey of madness, has found a better, an exalted, and an improved way over the other ways of living. This sounds like a form of intellectual pride and hypergamy, doesn't it? Next slide. Of course, there are some simple challenges here. What if one fails to make it through the irrational and insane portion of the journey on the enlightenment path. This is not just an academic question. We can even see in Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, one of the quintessential Enlightenment thinkers. He did not make it through his insanity. But worse is the insight offered here by non-believer H.P. Lovecraft, who said, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability for the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hereto armed us a little, but someday the piecing of dissociated knowledge will open us into such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light of knowledge into the peace and safety of a new dark age." What a quote. Next slide. If the path to enlightenment and its hypersanity passes through the irrational and the insane until finally one finds one's own internal mythopoetry, then as a Christian, I want to ask, why not Christianity? Its critics from the Enlightenment accuse Christianity itself of being myth and legend. But that's precisely the well from which the hypersane drink from in order to make their transition. Why not Christianity? Why indeed? For Herman Bavinck's generous theology, this is Romans 9:18.